What is the next step you need to take to continue to progress your knowledge of the languages, the biblical languages, so that you can get more fluent in them? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. I'm going to give you 4 different stages that you could be at in your journey to mastery of the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Old Testament, and I'm going to give you some steps and ideas for here's what to try next. So let's get into it. So let's start with the obvious place to start, and maybe this is you. Maybe you're doing some word studies using maybe Logos Bible software, perhaps you've got a copy of BDAG or some other lexicon, or even maybe just a Strong's Concordance. And what you do is you look at a word, you look at the Strong's number, and then you go look up that word to see what it means in Greek. Or perhaps you're just using an interlinear Bible and sort of just trundling along, sort of seeing what each word is and trying to understand or trying to put together how the translators got their translation from an interlinear. In these cases, you've really got very little knowledge of the actual language. You don't really understand how language works. You're just sort of picking your way through. And it could be that you're not even at this stage, and that's totally okay. At this point though, the question then is, well, what do you need to do next? Well, here's a simple step. Rather than go whole hog and say, you know what, the next step for me is going to be to read the New Testament in Greek. Well, that might be a step too far for you. So here's an intermediate step to consider. What about learning to use software so that you can use the languages a little bit more effectively? And what I really mean by that is actually learn a little bit about the language, but not so much that you're actually ever going to be, planning to get off the tools. Now, in the past, I've not really been a big fan of this, but I'm kind of changing my tune a little bit here. And the reason for this is very simple. If you get that far in Greek, why wouldn't you just keep going? Especially if there's a path ahead of you. And I'm working on putting together a path for exactly this kind of scenario. If you're interested in that, leave a comment in the comment section below. I look forward to hearing from you there. But there's a couple of things you can do. If you're at that very early stage, maybe working with an interlinear, maybe doing some word studies, but you're not really going anywhere with your Greek and you don't really understand the language. The first one is you might want to consider getting a copy of either It's Greek to Me by Mounce or Danny Zacharias' Biblical Greek Made Simple. Both of these are designed to help you prepare, learn enough of the language so that you can work with the original languages within the tools, but you're not actually going to be able to read. So you understand the difference between, say, an aorist tense form and a present tense form, but you're not really going to be able to read the text or even do much in the way of translation, at least not without relying really heavily on the software for that. So that would be a really helpful next step. And the reason this would be a helpful next step is simply this. You're going from where you are right now to something greater than where you are right now. And that's really what I want to encourage you to do. I want to encourage you to go way beyond where you are right now, to challenge yourself, not to be content with the current level of knowledge you have in the language. And if you're interested in doing just that, then I want to encourage you to download our Roadmap to Mastery at biblicalmastery.academy/roadmap, bma.to/roadmap. And you can download it and it will give you a next steps kind of guide to what to do from here to get started. So download that at bma.to/roadmap. So that's if you're really just starting out. But what about if you're already at that stage where you're sort of starting to use the tools? Maybe you've got a little bit of a knowledge of the language. Maybe you're doing a little bit more than just word studies. Perhaps you're dabbling in, say, some morphological, searches or something like that. You're able to tell perhaps a pronoun from a noun or from a verb for that matter as well. And so you're able to do some basic translation work, but you're still relying really heavily on the translation tools, namely BibleWorks, Logos Bible software, whatever it happens to be, Accordance, it doesn't really matter which one. The point is that you need the software to actually allow you to do this work. And this may apply to some of you who have actually learnt Greek in the past and have kind of forgotten it, but you've still got enough knowledge of the language to actually kind of work with the tools. Well, if this is you, then the question is, well, what next? And here's the thing. You're actually not that far away from being able to read the New Testament with a fair degree of fluency. I mean, at the end of beginning Greek, you're able to do translation really without needing to depend heavily on tools. So you're not that far from finishing beginning Greek, so it's really just going to take a little bit of work to get to that next stage. What does that look like? Well, it's going to differ depending on how you got to the stage that you're at right now. If you're just kind of dabbling around and doing a little bit of research here and there and you kind of picked up bits and pieces that way, then you probably want to do a full, properly organized beginning Greek course to go from where you are to learn to be able to identify forms without having to think too much. And that's what a grammar like beginning with New Testament Greek, this is the one that I use and teach from, that's what a grammar like this is designed to do. It's an organized way of just sort of taking you to that next step so you're able to read the New Testament, read the Greek, whatever it happens to be, with a little bit of confidence. Now, it's not going to get you all the way to where you might want to go, but it's going to get you a long way through that really difficult beginning Greek stage. The other thing that you might want to consider, particularly if you've already learnt Greek in the past and you're picking it up the second time, but even if you've already learned some stuff, is that going through a grammar like this, when you've got a level of knowledge already, will probably be a lot easier than if you've never been through a grammar like this at all. And so it may not be as much work as you think to actually go and, pick this up and get into learning the language for yourself. Now, having said that though, it does depend on exactly how far you are along, and it could be that there's a little bit of fudge room between stage one, the no Greek stage, where you're using interlinear and doing some word studies, and really where you are. You don't know what you don't know, right? And so there's a good chance that you're actually maybe not as far along as you want, and so when you come to a beginning Greek grammar, you find, this is actually a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, because you actually didn't know as much to start with. So it just depends on where you're at in those two stages. But going through a beginning Greek grammar like this will be a really helpful next step to really try and nail down those basics, get them down well, so that you're able to move on to the next stage, which is the third step, which is a basic set of translation skills. And at this point, you're able to pick up a lot of Greek text in the New Testament. You can recognize the words that occur really often. You're able to hammer out a basic translation with a little bit of help, maybe looking up a word here and there. Typically at this stage, you're going to be using a reader's edition because there's a lot of vocabulary you don't know. But all in all, you understand the rules well enough to be able to make your way through a text, albeit slowly and with stumbling. And because of this, you've probably got enough skills to prepare for a sermon, do an exegetical outline, things like that, but you probably don't have the skills for full-on fluent reading, and that would be the point of frustration for you. So at this point then, you want to be able to get to the point where you're able to sight read. Now, this means then that you're going to be able to pick up a text and just read through it without having to look up any or hardly any words, because you recognize them and you understand how the language is working, you know the vocabulary, and so on. And the way I recommend you do this is exactly where I started everything that I do, at exactly this point. How do I get through this next stage and not forget my Greek and go backwards to just using tools again, like so many people seem to do? And the answer I came up with was to actually learn the vocabulary book by book. And I created the Master New Testament Greek Vocab Pack, as we are about to call it, that is designed to take you book by book through the Greek New Testament, learning the vocabulary as you go, so that you're able to learn a new book of the New Testament roughly every 2 months on average. Now, some books are longer, some are shorter, but on average, every 2 months, you'll learn to read another book of the Greek New Testament with fluency. That is to say, you won't need to go looking up all the words. This is perfect for the stage you're at. And we also have, of course, the entire Biblical Mastery Academy Mastery memberships that's designed to get you to do this, not just with Greek, but now also with Hebrew as well. And so I want to encourage you, if you're at this stage, at the end of beginning Greek, and you're able to start stumbling your way through some translation work, well, you're at the beginning you're on the threshold of great discoveries. And I want to encourage you, keep up the great work. There is a lot of good stuff ahead. Don't give up now. Don't think you've arrived. There's a lot more to do, and there's a lot of joy ahead for you as well. But there will take some sort of disciplined work if you really want to get to that next stage where you're really able to read pretty much most of the New Testament with some degree of fluency and without too much trouble. Because the key thing I'm trying to get you to do at this point is to build up your reading comprehension. So you need to be reading regularly, you need to be reading large amounts of text, and you want to start from the easiest text and go all the way to the most difficult ones. And that's what the vocab pack is intended to do. If you're interested in that, you'll find a link to that down below in the description. The fourth stage then is, well, what about if you're beyond that? You've already got a good vocabulary. Maybe in seminary you learned down to 10 occurrences. Well, that's pretty good, right? So that's, it sounds a lot better than it really is, because it's only about, there's about 660 words to get down to 20 occurrences. It's in few hundred more than that to get down to 15 and a few hundred down to 10. It's not that many. There's 5,200, 5,300 words thereabouts in the New Testament to learn, so you're not learning that big a proportion of them. And so anyway, but the point is that if you're at this fourth stage where you're reading a good chunk of the text, you know those common words, you're still dependent for the most part on a reader's edition, but there are some texts you're really familiar with and you're able to get through those without too much difficulty. Perhaps the writings of Paul aren't particularly challenging at this point, but at the same time you've held off on some of those more challenging passages, like perhaps Luke's writings because he's got such a vocabulary, or perhaps it's the book of Hebrews you've never touched, or you got to Jude or 2 Peter and you're like, oh my goodness, what on earth is going on here? And which is entirely normal because those are all slightly more difficult texts to read in the New Testament. So if this is you and you've got a basic sort of reading capability going and maybe you're still working on it and you think just a few more years and I'll probably get there, well, here's my advice to you. First of all, focus on the texts that you are less familiar with. Those harder texts that you are yet to tackle are well worth taking on. And the reason for this is that they're going to push you to learn more Greek. Yes, you're going to be slower, but here's what you do. You go through it for the first time slowly. You go through it a second time more quickly, and you go through it a third time and you'll find your speed increases each time. And if it doesn't take 3, maybe it takes 4, 5, 6 reads, it doesn't really matter. The point is that as you continue to improve your fluency going through those more difficult books, it will affect your ability to read the New Testament or Greek or Hebrew or whatever it happens to be more generally anyway. And you can also expand. If you're in the Greek New Testament, you can expand into the Apostolic Fathers, you can expand in the Septuagint, and this is all going to give you a lot more experience with Greek and get you a lot further down the track than if you just sort of keep going through those regular texts that you're familiar with. The other question at this point that I would ask is, how is your grammar? A lot of people, particularly if you have learnt using, say, a natural language acquisition approach, you're not going to be used to thinking in terms of, categories of the genitive or the way the participles are working or whatever. And that's okay. But if you want to get in and do some exegetical study at some point, you probably want to learn those things so that you can go to the grammars and you can go to the commentaries and you can actually understand what they're talking about and the arguments that they're making. And if that's the case, you probably want to go not only get a beginning Greek grammar, but I would say go and get something like Mathewson and Emig. I'll leave a link in the comment section in the description below. But go and get an intermediate grammar like Mathewson and Emig's intermediate Greek grammar and go through that and learn the vocabulary. Do the exercises and get into that as well. That's going to help you fill out your knowledge of the grammar so you'll be able to understand some of the arguments in those commentaries. The other thing you want to do, particularly as you're reading those more advanced texts, is you might want to fill out the vocabulary that you're lacking in. And to do that, you could again use the Master New Testament Greek Vocab Pack, which again I mentioned earlier on. And with 2 modes in there. There's one book by book, but you can also go book by occurrence, which means you can focus just on the rare words. That means then you could go to, say, the book of Acts, and you could learn the hapax legomena that occur in, say, chapter 27, where you've got that nautical section, and get yourself familiar with that. And that way, when you get to that section, you're going to be less stumped because you know a lot more of the words. So that would be another way of just expanding out your vocabulary so that you're able to read those more difficult texts without the same challenge. And the key here then is to read those texts repeatedly until you can do so without having to look words up, just by sight. Okay, and as you do that, your knowledge of the language will just increase and all of those challenges will just eventually drop away. Once you've done that, then there's one more challenge I want to encourage you to do, and this is really the level that I want to encourage all of you to kind of aim to get to. Now, if you're going to be reading your Bible in a year, that typically means, like a lot of Bible in a year programs, they differ, but typically if you were going to read roughly a chapter a day, it's not quite this. If you're going to read through the New Testament, it's not very long, right? It's about 6 months you can read through the whole thing pretty comfortably. And that's in English. My encouragement would be to set yourself a goal of being able to do that in Greek. It does take a little bit more time, particularly because your Greek tends to be a little bit slower in your comprehension than your English. But if you can set yourself that goal, then you're in a position where twice every year you can read the entire Greek New Testament without looking words up and with a degree of fluency. And not only that, but if you aim to be able to do that and have knowledge of the grammar, then you'll be able to not only do that, but actually study the text in the depths that you really want to be able to do so as somebody who is a Bible student. And that's really the desire that I have for you, is that you know the language so you can know the words, so that you can study the words, so that you can know Christ. Ultimately, that's what this whole exercise is all about. And of course, you don't wait till the end to get any of those benefits. All those benefits are yours, even just from that second stage of having some very basic translation skills. So with that, I want to encourage you, this is what we do at Biblical Mastery Academy. And if you're interested in what we do, go to bma.to/roadmap and download your free roadmap or starter pack today and get underway with learning a little bit more Greek than what you have. Now, we are also putting together some new material for make things a little bit easier to get to that level that you've got some basic skills, and then encourage you and inspire you really to go way beyond that. So if you're interested in that, again, sign up for the roadmap, get on our mailing list, and we'll let you know about that when those opportunities come up. I'm really excited about how we're going to be able to serve you in the future, so stay tuned and I look forward to introducing more to you when the time comes. And until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. See you then.